Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures, Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is understanding animal dignity, and it will be presented by writer and researcher in the field of history of science, Melanie Challenger. Melanie, thank you so much for being here today and for bringing us this very unique and interesting topic, which is clearly a passion of yours. So very excited to go ahead and just dive in.
Thank you very much, Sunny, and thank you for inviting me to come along and speak to you all today. I have to say, I was saying to Sunny earlier, this is the new book. And it's out in 2 weeks' time. And so you are my very first people to be talking to about this. So it's a real privilege to be here, but also I'm going to be very interested to engage in a conversation with you. So dignity is quite a dense subject in some ways, even though it's incredibly intuitive. So I'm going to do a mixture of sort of taking you through the core ideas that are in the research here, that are in the book, and I'll read you some little sections of it here or there as well. And then I think we'll open it out into a conversation so that I can respond to the sorts of questions that are arising in your mind when we think about animal dignity. So before I start, I'll just explain a little bit about my background and how I ended up writing this. So I'm actually started in the creative arts many moons ago, and I still work in the creative arts as a poet and also as a librettist for classical music. That's sort of one side of my brain in life. But in the other side, a long time ago now, I sort of moved into writing non-fiction, primarily for mainstream general trade audiences. And my first book was called On Extinction. It was a young person's environmental history, really, of the mixed, so the biodiversity crisis, but also industrial and cultural extinctions, or and broadly it was an overview of the kind of entangled environmental crises that we face. While I was doing that work, I became very intrigued by the kinds of ways that we have thought about being animals ourselves. And this is a key part in how I understand animal dignity. So that's why I'm sort of building this history in. So I was looking at extinction, all kinds of different kinds of extinctions, and it struck me that the way that we think about our lives, the way that we respond to what it is to be mortal, to be flesh and blood, is a key to the way that we think about and value the living world around us and how we gather meaning in our lives. And so that led on to the second book that I worked on that took about 10 years to research, all in all, which was called How to Be Animal. I published it a couple of years ago. And that was How to Be Animal really looks at what it means for us morally, psychologically, and philosophically that we are animals. So I argue my kind of central thesis is that we, at some level, throughout history, throughout times, in lots of different cultures, at some level struggle with the idea that we're animals and what follows for us from being animals. So if you think about dualism, for instance, so substance dualism, so this is the idea that we are made up of two different kinds of substance, physical substance, so our flesh and blood bodies, and then also a spiritual substance. And this idea, this kind of dualism, is throughout cultures around the world and across time. And it's very particular to the way that we have thought about what it is to be alive. You can see it in Christianity or the Abrahamic faiths, where the substance dualism is really between the soul and the body. And you can see it in Indigenous worldviews, where there is still this sort of spiritual part, but it's a spiritual part that tends to be shared by all of the living world. So it's a sort of life essence, and then the physical being. Either way, this is, even when we get to Enlightenment thinkers, for instance, we still perhaps have this idea that human beings are separated between the kind of really important bit of them, which is maybe, if we're John Locke or we're Immanuel Kant, is our thinking or our moral capacity, so our minds, and our bodies, which are sort of animal part of us is less important. As part of that study, I started to look at dignity. There were two things that I was particularly intrigued by. I was intrigued by the way that we have used dignity as an idea to try to bias us towards being a more compassionate, more moral person. So when we think about dignity now, we tend to think about dignity as emerging, even though it's an older idea, as emerging as a really, really common way of thinking morally after the Second World War, while really a whole generation was psychologically scarred from what had taken place and confronting some of the worst that human beings could mete out upon one another. And dignity has emerged as an incredibly powerful tool that has found its way into more than 100 constitutions around the world and is enshrined, of course, in the UN Human Rights Charter, and is now seen as what grounds human rights. And so I was sort of looking at dignity very much as, in some ways, a part of this long history of dualism. So dignity is something that people don't quite know what it is or where it comes from, but it's soul-like in the way that we talk about dignity. And yet when I started to think about it, for me, I felt that dignity was about encouraging us to relate in a very positive way. So going back to the idea of how we, the kind of tension that is inherent in us in being animals, we find that, we human beings we're social primates. So on the one hand, we're incredibly social, highly social, unusually social as a primate. We build connections across groups that are completely unrelated, across strangers. We have an incredible capacity to bond with those who are not our kin or not our immediate relatives, and even not the same species as us. And a lot of this is all done mentally. It then has an impact physically, but it's done mentally. It's to do with mental kind of ways of bonding with one another, seeing someone else as valuable in some kind of way. And it struck me that that was what dignity was doing for us. And that made me ponder whether, even if we see it as an abstract concept, or however we kind of think about the concept of dignity itself, that dignity could potentially do some really good work in the world when it comes to improving our relationship to the rest of the living world. So that was how I sort of came into this. And initially I thought I would write the book myself as a solo author, but I quickly realized that for this to be effective, it would be better if it wasn't just one person's voice, and it would also be improved by examining how dignity matters and where dignity might appear across lots of different cultures and different contexts. And I'll go into a little bit of that. So we ended up doing a shared endeavour. So the book opens with an introduction and a preface from Jane Goodall. And then I sort of break down, the sort of introduce the whole concept. And then we have creative interludes by people like Jonathan Safran Foer, Cy Montgomery, Greg Santos Perez. And then we have philosophical contributions from lots of different kinds of authors, some of them very accessible, some of them more scholarly in their tone. So it's a real hybrid book in that respect. We have people like Martha Nussbaum, Laurie Gruen, who are well known in these areas. And then we also have authors from looking at dignity from different cultures. So I've got Julius Kapembois, for instance, who is writing about African conceptions of dignity, Mira Bender, who's looking at Indian conceptions, and we have Christina Eisenberg and Michael Paul Nelson, who are looking at animal dignity through both a Western and an Indigenous perspective. So the first thing I'm going to do is just read you. I have these little preludes at the start of each of the sections of the book, and they're usually they're a poem or they're a piece of creative non-fiction or fiction. And I'm going to start with a short prelude by the author Simon Rich, which is called Frogs. And we have a picture of a frog in here too, by a wonderful photojournalist called Joanne MacArthur of We Animals Media, who provides a lot of the images in this book, and she does incredible work photographing animals on their own terms, if you like. So this is called Frogs. Hey, can I ask you something? Why did human children dissect us? It's part of their education. They cut open our bodies in school and they write reports about their findings. Well, I guess it could be worse, right? I mean, at least we're not dying in vain. How do you figure? Well, our deaths are furthering the spread of knowledge. It's a huge sacrifice we're making, but at least some good comes out of it. Let me show you something. What's this? It's a frog dissection report. Who wrote it? 14-year-old human from New York City, some kid called Simon. He flips through it. This is it. This is the whole thing. Jeez, doesn't look like I put a lot of time into this. Look at the diagram on the last page. Oh my God, it's so crude. It's almost as if he wasn't even looking at the paper while he was drawing it, like he was watching TV or something. Read the conclusion. In conclusion, frogs are a scientific wonder of biology. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. Why are the margins so big? He was trying to make it look as if he'd written 5 pages, even though he'd only written 4. He couldn't come up with one more page of observations about our dead bodies. I guess not. This paragraph looks like it was copied straight out of an encyclopedia. I'd be shocked if he retained any of this information. Did you see that he misspelled science wrong in the heading? Oh, I missed that. That's incredible. He didn't even bother to run it through spell check. Who did he dissect? Harold. Betsy's husband? Jesus! So this is why Harold was killed, to produce this report? Nods. This is why his life was taken from him? Long pause. Well, at least it has a cover sheet. Yeah, the plastic's a nice touch. So I go on to take this apart because I think even though it's humor and even though it's a humorous sketch, it helps us to ground what we're looking at when we look at dignity. So I write here, Simon Rich's humorous sketch, which opens this book, turns on an idea of dignity we can all grasp. In the story, we have 2 frogs pondering the degradations that follow from the fact that they're classroom specimens, kept alive only until they be used as dissection models. At first, the predicament doesn't seem so bad. They die nobly to further the spread of knowledge. But this is swiftly undercut by recognition of the lackluster reports handed in by the children. At one level, this humour works through anthropomorphism. We know the frogs can't chat together about human inventions like spell check, and nor do they give one another names like Betsy and Harold. We could argue that the joke is on the frogs because they're not smart enough to get the joke in the first place. Yet Rich subverts this in his punchline. the gratitude the frogs express for the plastic sheeting is perfect pathos. It's a pathetic sentiment, not because it exposes the baseness of the frogs, but rather our own dereliction. The frog's thankfulness for a plastic document is only funny because we realise the absolute indignity with which we treat many animals in our lives. So the first thing we do, I think, when we think about animal dignity is we have to overcome a psychological hurdle. And that's why I went in with humour straight away. I think that I've lost count of the number of people when I've sort of talked about this idea have said, yeah, but obviously not all animals could have dignity, right? I mean, a mosquito couldn't have dignity, or just bear with me a second. A rat couldn't have dignity, or a slug couldn't have dignity. People tend to make a sort of bit of a joke initially themselves, and I think it's partly because it makes people a bit nervous, but I also think it's because we exist at a time when we have degraded other species. The way that we think about them is constantly measured against us. So other species are in some ways kind of subhumans always. They're always just measured below us. And that can make it a real, there's a barrier there when we come to take other species seriously. The other obvious barrier there is, when we try to define what we mean by dignity ourselves, dignity has always been a controversial idea within philosophy. In fact, it's been sort of treated with a bit of sniffiness within philosophy, because particularly within my work, so I work in bioethics and I'm deputy chair of the UK's national bioethics body, the Nuffield Council, and we within bioethics, the idea of dignity is, on the one hand, can't be dismissed because it's hugely important within care contexts, within end-of-life care, within any situation where people are vulnerable or there's a kind of a power imbalance because of an individual's vulnerability. So particularly in hospital, research or care settings, dignity is enormously important. You will find most institutions like that will have a kind of dignity charter of some kind written within, to guide conduct for the people who work in that context. And there's been lots of really good research done on dignity in care settings where participants in surveys have defined dignity for themselves, and very often we get similar sorts of things that come out of that. How important individual respect is, autonomy, being listened to, and these sorts of things, and recognising what people need to flourish as individuals. These are all part of this sort of cluster concept, if you like, of what dignity is. That's all really helpful for us in understanding, but philosophers tend to say, yeah, but when we pick it apart, we need to know what grounds it, what exactly is at the heart of, is dignity a thing we possess, or is dignity something that emerges through certain kinds of relations? And these are the sorts of discussions that have taken place more broadly within philosophy. And so it's always been accused of being a bit of a sort of amorphous, bit of a blurry concept, and yet we have to account for the fact that dignity is incredibly important. It's one of the most widespread philosophical concepts. It's incredibly useful to people, and intuitively people will understand it. I remember asking my son, who was 8, whether he knew what dignity meant, and he sort of said, well, I know exactly what it means, but it's difficult to put into words. And I think that is because dignity is, in fact, very intuitive to us. It's putting into words something that isn't just one simple thing, but that we somehow know it when we see it or when we come across it. And there isn't another word that can quite do what dignity can do for us. Nonetheless, when we're talking about making the leap into animal dignity, the challenge is in defining what the concept is. So how do we give a good account of dignity? there are certain kind of common claims with dignity. The first is fundamental value status. So dignity is seen as this non-transferable, non-exchangeable fundamental status. So you treat every human being with dignity, is about valuing them without any other justification, just valuing them as because human beings are fundamentally valuable. And then there's a normative part of it. So in other words, that status, that special status has consequences in how we ought to behave towards one another. So there are certain objectification is very common. There is, that we shouldn't objectify one another, we shouldn't enslave one another, for instance. That would be seen as a very clear dignity violation. So there is a normative element to this status. All of that, I think, isn't a huge hurdle for us when it comes to other species. But the third, probably commonest claim about dignity is that it is about a unique value that is inherent to humans. So when I said at the start that was something that I was looking at very much when I was studying kind of how we've related to being animals ourselves, that was because I was trying to push at that human exceptionalist idea and really see whether that was justified. In the book, we have a really great overview by a philosopher called Remy Deeb, and he looks at Kant through the really early Roman idea of dignitas, and then Kant as the kind of best known philosopher on dignity. And he picks apart the history of the idea of dignity to suggest that idea that it is unique to humans isn't justified necessarily, even though there's certainly something that Kant said, but in terms of the idea itself, there's no reason really why we should have to see this as something that is inherent to humans. That said, we still have to get over the hurdle of what we think grounds dignity in humans or animals. For most of the authors in the book, this lovely kind of consensus does emerge, even though there are very different conceptions and approaches to dignity. But generally, most people believe that dignity is a kind of special kind of moral attention. And something that I find really compelling is that there are real correlates of dignity in different cultures. So in Africa, the idea of Ubuntu, which is quite, very much about what it is to be human or how we should morally relate to one another, the kind of good way of being with another, is a very, very close to what I think dignity is doing for us a lot of the time, which is about asking us to attend to another as a valuable being in their own right, to pay attention to them, but to pay attention to them in a moralized way, in a morally rich way, from which we gain then guidance in how we ought to behave and interact with one another. A really beautiful essay in this, I'll see if I can read you a tiny bit of it, in this, one of my favourites, which I probably shouldn't admit to, but is by Mira Bendur, who writes a contribution called Let All Beings Be Happy, Dignity and Prana, the Vital Force in Indian Thought. Now, she's a philosopher in India, in Bangalore, and she's done a lot of work with rural communities in India, and has found that a correlate of dignity that's very widespread, particularly in rural communities, but broadly within Indian thought, is that life is a kind of, isn't just a state, but it's a condition of being, so a way of being in the world, and that's what prana is all about. But what she's found is that there's this idea, very common idea, of prana ringing, or ringing the prana, And that's very close to, I think, the Western idea of dignity. And with ringing the prana, let me see if I can just find a little section for you to read. This is the idea that you are not paying attention to the real, and respecting and honouring the being in front of you, and that you're treating them in a certain kind of way that is undignified, but in the context of prana would be called prana ringing. Kicking a stone out of place in the garden to look at the insects under it was met with a stern warning, she says. Don't disturb the life of being. Pets were discouraged. There were useful animals, the dog for guarding, the horse for riding, the cow for milk, but there was no paw renting. We loved animals as our duty and not as our passion. In this traditional Indian perspective, the act of domestication is a transfer of the duty of shelter to the nature from nature to the human. The animal becomes dependent on a human for its survival and loses its original nature. This can be understood as a dissolution of dignity in the web of creation, with every being that has its own place and role. Honour comes up again in some of our further discussions with Indigenous versus Western perspectives, that this kind of way of relating with honour is really fundamental to what we're talking about when we're talking about animal dignity. So then the last section of the book is really to look at the work that dignity could do for us in the world. And here really it's about seeing how dignity, animal dignity, could fit into constitutions, for instance, how it relates to current sort of welfare approaches, and what it would mean for us if we were to treat other species with dignity. I think there are lots of places where animal dignity could do some really good work in the world, not least things, for instance, like genetic alterations to animals, so CRISPR, chimeric animals, confronting the kind of exploitation impasse that we're at, that welfare hasn't managed to resolve in itself. But fundamentally, it's about resetting our relationships with other species, encouraging us to think about and relate to other beings in a completely new way that is grounded in a fundamental respect. From that comes the charge that we have to rethink how we objectify other animals, that objectification could be seen as a dignity violation. So it's going to reset the way that we would exploit or relate to other beings, and would be quite far-reaching. But I think the first bit of work when we think about animal dignity is really to consider, as I said, how we define dignity and how we can relate dignity to other animals. And I think that we hopefully in this book are able to make a good case for that. So I've talked at you for sort of half an hour, 35 minutes, just throwing the ideas at, but I think probably the best thing would be to start to open up to questions so that I can then get into a conversation with you about it, because dignity, it's difficult to sit there and listen to dignity alone for kind of too long, or philosophy for too long in that kind of way. But I would be really interested to hear what your thoughts are at this stage, and I'll try and answer your questions.
Melanie, thank you so much. Before we start the Q&A period, I want to remind everyone that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. We've got lots of comments of, interesting and great topic and so forth, but not a lot of questions yet. So we'll give it some time. But I want to ask you.
Just to pause you for a second, Sunny, is there somewhere that I should be able to see the comments, or because I can't see them at the minute?
If you look in your chat, there's a chat like in your, let's see, in the box, like the control panel box, there should be a chat that you should.
Okay, so I can open it out. I've got it.
Yeah. So there is a question about where is the book available? We can start there and then dive more into the philosophy.
I'm still not seeing. I've opened up the chat. Sorry, everyone. I can't see anything yet, but never mind. So the book is published by Bloomsbury, and you should be able to. It was be just a pre-order at the moment, but it'll be coming out in the next over the next sort of. I think it's out on the 3rd of November. And you can buy it either directly from Bloomsbury or Amazon or any of the sort of usual places.
Mm. So we do have a question, actually a really good one to start with. Before we even get to animal dignity, how do we get to human dignity? Our culture seems unable to treat other humans with dignity if they're not a part of our social group, aged, mentally, physically challenged, poor, etc. How can we possibly extend the concept of dignity to animals? Where do we start?
Yeah, it's a really, really brilliant first and rich first question. So I'm going to take us back to the work that I was telling you about in terms of how to be animal and what it means for us to be animals. Because I think this all relates both to that question, to how we can have better relations with one another, and what it means if we extend this to other species. So human beings are obviously a highly social primate. We say that we have all kinds of different ways that aspects of our social cognition and our biology that encourage us to bond with one another. Usually we're resurfacing maternal child bonds. So the kinds of biology and hormones and so forth that we use to bond with our young, with our infants, and with our mothers is resurfaced in our relationship with one another later in life. So our partnerships, our friendships. So, classic example of this would be oxytocin. So oxytocin is implicated in it's released when we breastfeed, for instance, and it's implicated in the maternal-child bond. It makes us feel good. It's known as the cuddle hormone. And sure enough, when we are sort of being nice to one another, treating one another with dignity, oxytocin will rise in the two individuals or the group who are being, affiliating with one another, bonding with one another. And that goes across the human-animal border also. So if we look into the eyes of our dogs, for instance, or our horse, or whoever our companion animal is, we will experience an oxytocin spike, and so will the dog, so will the horse, for instance. It's a mammalian way of relating to one another. So we have all of this fantastic, and it's not just that, there's lots and lots of things, different aspects of your social cognition, your prefrontal cortex, aspects of all help us to bond with one another. That's because being in a group has a really high premium for human beings. But the flip side of this is that being in a very tightly bonded group also comes with a whole range of negative elements, from the spread of pathogens, for instance, we've just lived through that, to competition within the group and between groups. And human beings are particular in that we have very low reactive aggression relatively compared to some other primates, but we have very high proactive aggression. And a lot of that comes, it comes from these sorts of intergroup conflicts. Now, within the mix here as well is another whole area of kind of scientific data that relates to this, which is how we come to facilitate being aggressive when we're actually a very pro-social kind of social affiliative animal. How is it that we overcome the tendency to bond with one another and turn that into, in fact, aggression? And there are lots of things that go on. One thing can be that, aspects of our brains, don't light up when we're when we're interacting with someone that we, want to exploit, for instance. We tend to dehumanize one another, so we use kind of metaphors like someone is a pathogen-bearing animal, so they're like a rat, or they're plague-like, or what have you. And these sorts of things kick off our disgust mechanisms, lower our tendency to bond with another person or to sympathize with them. So we have all of this kind of physical architecture that can either bring us together or can pull us apart, can facilitate aggression or exploitation, or can, on the converse, can enable us to be supportive and pro-social. Now, where does dignity come into this? Well, I think that is such a live part of how human beings are engaging with one another. Something that I didn't say also is that we tend to infer more mind, more agency, more intelligence in those that we're bonding with, those that we are seeing as part of our group, our in-group, than we do those we see as part of our out-group. So an example of this could be that if we see someone as part of the out-group, we might see them as having lower secondary emotions. So they have primary emotions like hate, but they might not have like secondary emotions like humiliation that we see as being more intelligent, richer kind of. So with one another, as whoever that was who asked that brilliant question, with one another, we clearly have all of these different aspects of our social cognition that when it suits us, when we're in an aggressive and exploitative or an out-group kind of situation, we not only can dehumanize or degrade one another in our minds, but we infer that those individuals have less intelligence, less complex emotions, and therefore we are justified to a certain extent in either neglecting them or in the worst case scenario, in actively harming them. Now, my suspicion is that dignity is part of that whole picture. So it is a psychological amulet, if you like, that you put in place to try and frame that relationship more in an affiliative way and to reduce the tendency to be aggressive or to abuse or harm others. So that's what I think dignity is sort of trying to do for us. It's trying to set the relationships, frame the relationships right from the get-go as ones that are about respecting, looking on another with honour and respect. That said, we're living, you know, at a time at the moment, there's a war in Ukraine, there's what's happening in Gaza and Israel, where it can feel really hard to believe that we could make that leap to other animals when we can't even do that with one another. One little thing I would say about that is that there is some very interesting research. It came out of Canada, but it's been replicated in a bunch of other places now. If you were to look up Kimberly Costello and Graham Hodson, you would find some papers, and you know that can then lead you off to others, but those are two people I can think of straight away who've written about this, who've done some work in psychology of dehumanization. And they found that so looking specifically at animalistic dehumanization, because there's different kinds of dehumanization, but whether or not how we think about and relate to other animals, how that impacts our tendency to dehumanize one another. They found that if you sort of brought everybody down to the level of animals, so you just told everyone we're all animals, you know, none of us human beings don't matter, we don't have any real meaning to our lives, we're all just animals, that increased the tendency to dehumanize. Likewise, seeing things with a really human exceptionalist framing also tended to certainly not to make much difference to dehumanization or to increase the tendency. But what they found was that when you in fact elevated other species up with us, that was the kind of mental framing that had the most impact on dehumanizing tendencies. I think that's not altogether surprising. There's not the time today to go into it, but there's a very, very interesting area of research looking at social buffering. So social buffering is something that all social animals do. So for instance, if you've had some really horrible news, or you're an animal that's just been sort of survived an attack from a predator, you'll cuddle up with someone who's in your group, your kin group or whatever, and you might groom, or you might just be close to one another, and it lowers the respiratory rate, it lowers the heart rate, and it gets the body back into homeostasis. And so basically, group living animals tend to buffer one another, themselves from the harms of life by social proximity and through togetherness, basically. And human beings, unsurprisingly, do something very similar. So when we have a shock or some bad news, we come to one another for physical kind of closeness to make ourselves feel better. But we also psychologically buffer ourselves. So we use ideas to make ourselves feel better. And I think there's the tendency to see ourselves as superior, as the pinnacle of the Earth's creation, as unique and special, is a form of psychological buffering. But of course, it's built on a bit of an illusion. And so I think one of the reasons that having a more generous perspective towards the rest of the living world, one of the reasons that possibly quietens our anxiety or makes us more, positive, pro-social, is because it doesn't threaten us. Actually, it just kind of it buffers us in a way that I think is much more nourishing than a very, very hard-line kind of human exceptionalist idea does. That was lots that I threw at you there, but yeah, there's a lot to say and unpack when you ask a question like that.
Absolutely. There's so many directions you can go, and what it's done is stimulate a lot of more really great questions. So
I'm not seeing any of these. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have sort of chanted on.
We'll make sure you get them after okay. This is over, so that there's, just so you can get some reflections. But yeah. I'm going to link these two together.
Okay.
Do you believe that having pets deprives the animals of their dignity, and the same goes for eating animals?
Yeah, two really brilliant questions. Great. I very briefly touched on that prana ringing idea. So this idea in the kind of Indian correlate of dignity, that when you habituate an animal to a human idea of what that animal should be, that is ringing its prana, bringing its life force out, that is acting against the dignity of that being. So I do think that there are ways in which we engage with companion animals that could be seen as dignity violations across all of the different cultural conceptions of dignity. So, for instance, dressing your pets up, or you could argue the kinds of, I forget what they're called, but the dogs that have been bred so that they can barely breathe, the sort of pug-faced dogs. That have been bred for human tastes and human desires, but it's actually really bad for them. It's not healthy for them. I think, again, that kind of imposition of a human fashion item or a human idea of what we think, this animal ought to be, and that kind of taking control of their reproductive behaviours so that they're nudged in a human direction, I think those are dignity violations, yes. Do I think that a respectful relationship with an animal, that's really going to a question more of whether we think domestication or the process of domestication is a dignity violation, because I think that it's perfectly possible for people to have very loving, very dignified relations with companion animals. And I myself don't think that that broadly is a problem with dignity. I think it's more to do with whether we are the extent to which we are objectifying an animal such that we're just turning them into something that is purely for our own desire or our own idea of what they ought to be. Domestication is a more complex one. domestication anyway, the process of domestication isn't just one thing, and it's not that well fully understood, of course. You could look at house mice, and they've kind of domesticated themselves. Canids, wolves, probably domesticate. It was probably a two-way thing. You know, it was advantageous to them, and it was also advantageous to us. So, and that may have also happened in the very, very early days with ungulates as well. We don't know, but I think, you know, domestication per se, or there being domesticated animals per se, that's a natural process. We've probably domesticated ourselves. We ourselves are probably a domesticate of sorts, a domestic primate, if you like. So I think that's a natural process. But I do think that that when we are talking about completely taking over the reproductive behaviour of an animal, so the sorts of ways that we treat cows, and this is moved into the other part of that question, how we eat other animals, are going pretty far down, violating the dignity of an animal when it, you know, there's no freedom or no agency, or the animal can't express their interest in any kind of way. And so to speak to the wider food systems, it's very, very hard, I think, to say that factory farming upholds the dignity of the animals involved. And this is very different from place to place. In America, of course, you have far more animals that are being bred within factory farming situations. And I find it very difficult to imagine that there's anything dignified within a situation where animals can't go outside, they can't express any aspects of their natural impulses, their natural tendencies, the kind of way that they flourish. That said, you know, if someone has an enriched sort of boutique farm where they're free range, or the animals are there's no cow-calf separation, for instance, you're going to be looking at a very different kind of relationship. And you know, the question of whether we should ever kill animals at all is a much wider, much broader question. I don't think, in fact, that's what dignity can talk about. I don't think that's the work that dignity does. I think that's a different kind of moral and philosophical question. I think dignity really is about objectifying another being, or stripping them of any inherent status such that other harms follow from that. So I certainly think it's true that you can degrade or violate the dignity of another being such that killing becomes inevitable. That, I think, is certainly true, and that's a relationship. But dignity doesn't necessarily determine that killing itself is always wrong, is what I would say.
Okay. The species that we give dignity to, in general, are animals that show consciousness of self, like dolphins, elephants. First, just in general, any thoughts on that? And then taking it a bit further, way down to plants. Where does the line end? You know, is this just about being sentient and being alive, or, you know, do plants deserve dignity too? So that's kind of a broad one as well.
It's a brilliant question. I'm really glad someone asked. So yes, we're big mentalizers. You know, human beings occupy a mental niche. So of course we put high premium on our kind of intelligence, and our kind of intelligence is extraordinary. I mean, we are a bizarre and wonderful creature. But you know, when I said right at the beginning that we can tend to see other humans as kind of subhumans, one of the dangers there is that we forget that other species have adapted, have evolved as a whole version of themselves. They're not a subhuman, they're just really good at being their own kind of being. One of the things that came out of our studies of dignity in humans is that actually the whole point with dignity is that it is in fact a value without measure. So you can think about the dignity of the dead, for instance, where there's no intelligent, conscious action anymore. And that's not just about the living who are left behind. It's about just the way that we think about either someone who is alive or who was alive, and how we want that relationship to be. I think that it's also very much with human beings about recognizing our individual nature. So dignity becomes very relevant with people with dementia, very relevant with people who are severely disabled or unable to communicate, or autistic, or any of these sorts of situations where anyone is vulnerable or feels like they're in a kind of situation where we have to value them for in their own right. So we don't value them because they're conscious, or we don't value them because they have a certain kind of threshold of intelligence. We value them for who they are as individuals. So that is the beauty of dignity in the human world, and that makes it in fact a good moral concept. Unlike personhood, for instance, it's a good kind of basis to extend across to other species, because in fact, it becomes about recognizing another being in their own very unique way, their own unique world. Not saying, of course, it's easier if they're more like us, that's just our own bias. But the logic of the idea is that, in fact, or the integrity of the idea, I should say, is that you meet another being on their own terms, as their own in their own individual unique nature, and you value them without threshold. You value them in their world of being on their own right. That, of course, opens to the excellent point that whoever it was made. Where do we stop? Because if this is a non-hierarchical way of relating to the rest of the living world, why should it stop at animals? I should say that there was not consensus within our group in the Animal Dignity book on this. Some people were very clear that it had to be sentient based at some level, that it therefore should really relate only to animals. But others were like, I don't see why there shouldn't be something like dignity attributed to plants and to trees and so forth. My own feeling about it in the end, so this is just personal, was that dignity is about a certain kind. Humiliation is always in there, and denigration is in the mix, and agency. And I think that there is something particular about animal agency, animal relations, that is different to what we see. We can definitely respect and honour plant life and vegetal life, but I think the kind of relations that become possible when you have beings that can vocalize or sniff one another or look one another in the eye, so among animals, and move towards or away from one another, it's a different set of relations. And I think dignity captures those kinds of relationships, those sorts of agentive relationships, more than I think a broader concept like respect might do.
Another sort of angle on this is, how do we cultivate dignity for ourselves? I think there's a lot of us walking around in an undignified way, or with a lack of self-worth. We don't operate necessarily like our lives matter. We're just sort of part of the pack and going along without really adding much meaning to our lives or living in a dignified way. So that's one piece that's coming out. And also, are there examples of animals treating other animals with dignity? Yeah. So really just looking at, is this an intrinsic value? Is it a way we treat others? Anyway, that's another big one. We got a few more minutes for you to just
I mean, gosh, you guys are right on it with the good questions. They're all like massive questions. This is what I was aware of. This is why I wanted to open it out into questions rather than just impose it all on you, because it's in the discussion that we start to surface the complexity and the richness. To the first point, So I definitely think that dignity is not um, a possession per se. It's not sort of something that we have in the same way that we have consciousness. It's much more relational. So it's much more about how I'm not saying it only emerges in relations, but I think that it's describing something, and that isn't inherent at all, but I think it's describing a kind of a way of relating to one another. And that, I think, can be that loop of positive relations can be purely internal. So it can be about valuing yourself also. I think that's absolutely right, that there is a way of treating oneself with dignity, of not hating yourself, of not degrading yourself, of valuing yourself. And that can be immensely difficult. But if you think of a lot of kind of self-harm or self-confidence issues, they often, it is something that you have to do. It is a way that you have to frame your relationship with yourself. So I definitely think that is part of the picture of dignity, that kind of self dignizing, yeah, whatever we would call that, dignitizing. But I think that in terms of what was the second question? My gosh, it's gone from my mind now.
Oh, yeah. The question was about animals treating other animals with
Yes,
dignity.
whether or
Is there
not
any
animals do.
evidence of
Yes,
that,
yeah.
or?
So there's been some interesting work done on chimpanzees. I mean, they're our closest relatives, so of course we can't be altogether surprised we might see something like this, with something they're kind of calling de-chimpization, that chimps, socially do a similar kind of thing that we do when we dehumanize one another, but they kind of de-chimpize one another. And there's, then there's the kind of and then we'll also do the opposite and kind of bond with one another. But I don't think, and in any social living animal, this is going to only really come about in relationships between animals, or in relationships with animals where they're highly social. The kind of, there's going to be something nascent there in those relations. But I think, given, if we even just talk about what I said earlier on, that we have such, which is unusual for us, we have such high proactive aggression but low reactive aggression. So we're actually not that, liable to just like scratch one another in the faces if we get annoyed. We are able to control that kind of impulse, even if we're feeling it inside ourselves. But then we can plot in our minds and do really ghastly things with one another. So I think dignity, what it is that dignity is describing in having better or worse relations with one another, yes, I think that is out there in the living world, particularly in animals that have close sets of relations. Particularly we see it with primates, we'll see it with probably large cats, we'll see it with elephants, we'll see it across mammals certainly, but probably in all kinds of different animals that have strong social relations, maybe even parrots. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some kinds of ways of navigating better or worse ways of relating. But I think it's human beings who have this particular kind of mental niche where we're going to see the necessity of a concept like dignity to kind of nudge us towards those more positive ways of relating.
Mm. Well, unfortunately, that's the last question we have time for today. There are so many wonderful, thoughtful, insightful questions. I know. I want to thank everybody for submitting their questions. This is definitely hours more conversation that we could have. But I'm going to turn it back to you at this time for any closing comments. Any way you can tie this together and tell us briefly why this is important, what change you see could happen if, dignity is more a part of our culture.
Yeah, we have to accept the fact that, just let's talk about mammals just for a minute, or even just primates. we've seen a 60% reduction in the population of chimpanzees, for instance, thereabouts. There's been, you know, of the kind of state that mammals should be, we have now 4% of wild mammals left in terms of mammalian biomass, and 70% that are now living in captive as part of our food systems. So massive sort of change in inversion of the kind of norm, if you like, of balance of life on our planet. And animals are now facing even more threats to their flourishing, from climate change to CRISPR-Cas9. Our ability to utilize and exploit other species is only increasing, rather than despite having environmental protections, welfare protections, and so forth. What we need is a reset in the way that we think about other species. And I think we can talk about rights, we can talk about legal status, for instance, but I think the first work that we have to do is psychological. And that's why I think dignity is one of the ideas that can be a really powerful moral ally in building a fairer set and more just set of relations with the rest of the living world.
Wow, that was that was a lot. I so appreciate you bringing us this topic. This is a real deviation from our normal format, and I would just encourage anybody who's viewing to offer comments about, you know, wanting to have more of this kind of, you know, philosophical discussion around these topics of conservation and nature and so forth, because it was a real refreshing shift for me, at least. And from the comments and questions, I think there's a lot who agree. So again, thank you for sharing that with us. Can you show us the book again?
Yes, of course. I'm not very good at doing this. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm like really wretched at.
The title is Animal Dignity, Philosophical Reflections on Non-Human Existence, Melanie Challenger. All right, thank you, Melanie. And I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. Please join us again next week for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, we'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Wonderful weekend. Do treat yourself and others with dignity.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Namaste, right?
Namaste. Namaste.
Bye-bye.
Bye.